Good evening. My name is Rob Lydon, and I'm the director emeritus at the center. Pleased to welcome you to the 13th Chatham Marconi Speaker Series presentation of 2024. We're fortunate to have teacher and author Robert McMaster with us tonight. Robert will be informing us about the life and accomplishments of scientist Edward Hitchcock. It was exactly 200 years ago, in 1824, that the geological history of the region first came to the attention of scientists around the world. That year, Massachusetts geologist Edward Hitchcock published a landmark paper on the geology of Martha's Vineyard in a new scientific journal. His insights into the island's past sparked a revolution in our understanding of the forces that shaped the vineyard, Cape Cod, and North America, eventually leading him to become the first American scientist to publicly endorse the theory of continental glaciation. In addition to the historical importance of the work, Hitchcock reveals other interesting findings from subsequent visits to the region. He describes a curious looming phenomenon he experienced on his visits to the Cape and Islands, and also tells of ancient submarine forests lurking beneath Holmes Hole, Nantucket Sound, and Cape Cod Bay. 2 centuries later, scientists are still fascinated by those curious relics of the past that emerge occasionally after storms or very low tides. Viewers will also enjoy Hitchcock's descriptions of familiar Cape landmarks, such as Truro Mountains of Sand, Provincetown's bucolic setting, which he found quite as effectual a remedy for ennui and other fashionable complaints as resort to Alston and Saratoga. And who can argue with Hitchcock when he writes of gay-headed Aquina? There is nothing to compare with it in New England. A bit about Robert. He earned his BA from Clark University and advanced degrees from Boston College, Smith College, and the University of Massachusetts. He was director of the Greenbrier Nature Center in Sandwich from 1982 to 1991. Taught biology at Holyoke Community College for 20 years. In 2021, he published All the Light Here Comes from Above, The Life and Legacy of Edward Hitchcock, Uncomonk Press, the first biography ever written of Edward Hitchcock. McMaster has also written 6 novels, the most recent of which is Fugitive from Injustice, Book 2 of the County Wicklow Mysteries. For more information on Edward Hitchcock, please visit www.edwardhitchcock.com. Following his presentations, Robert will answer your questions. And please use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And I will edit questions, consolidate them so that Robert can answer them most effectively. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Robert McMaster.
Well, thank you, Rob, for that nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you. My thanks to you and to Mary and everyone at the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center for making this event possible. And of course, thank you also to all of you folks for coming out this evening, whether you're in Chatham or wherever you are. Well, it's been over 30 years, I confess, since I last visited Chatham. But I remember it to be one of the loveliest, if not the loveliest towns on Cape Cod, and I'm betting it's still just as lovely. I actually spent 6 summers in that area. I was a counselor at a boys' camp called Camp Namequake, and maybe a few of you who remember it, long since gone. And on many an evening, I and my fellow counselors would travel to Chatham. I remember going to Cape Cod League games at Veterans Field, concerts at Gould Park, hearing live entertainment at the Outermost Beach Coffee House, which in those days was housed in the basement of the Congregational Church. And we would often end the evening at the Chatham Squire, on Main Street, which I understand is still in business. Um, and I had one particular adventure in Chatham in those young and foolhardy days. This was in my college and post-college years. Um, I put my canoe in at Oyster Pond and paddled it alone down the river to the Sound and then along the shore around Morris Island and up into Chatham Harbor. I don't imagine the Coast Guard would have approved, but somehow I got away with it and I survived to tell the story afterwards. But this evening, I want to talk to you about another story from a good deal further in the past. 2 centuries ago, actually, the events that I'm going to talk about took place, and they proved to be an important landmark in the history of Cape Cod and the islands, and also in the history of American geology. It's a story that has, I think, been long forgotten, but it's an important one. And this is a good time, 200 years after the initial publication, to remember that series of events. My story begins at Holmes Hole in June of 1823. That's the town we all know today as Vineyard Haven, right? The packet boat from New Bedford had just arrived, filled with cargo, but also with a few passengers. And one of them was a tall, gaunt figure dressed in black, the black top coat and a black stovepipe. He must have looked a little bit out of place amidst the hustle and bustle at dockside, surrounded by fishermen hawking their wares and liverymen loading their wagons. Well, that unlikely figure was Edward Hitchcock, the Reverend Edward Hitchcock, pastor of the tiny Congregational Church in Conway, here in Western Massachusetts. He had dedicated his life to preaching the word of God, to saving souls, but his mission on this spring day was not spiritual, it was scientific. Now, Edward Hitchcock was born in Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1793. As you may know, Deerfield sits at the confluence of two of New England's biggest rivers, the Connecticut and the Deerfield. He and his siblings all grew up in that house, which still stands close to the center of the town, and within sight of Deerfield Academy, which had just opened its doors in 1799. And Edward and his 4 siblings all attended Deerfield Academy. Edward attended the academy for parts of 6 years, from 1804 to 1809. And amazingly, those 6 years at Deerfield Academy would be the full extent of Edward Hitchcock's formal education, considering the many accomplishments he had later in life in science, in higher education, and in religion. Well, he left Deerfield Academy in 1809 as a student. He returned in 1816 as headmaster. Pretty good, considering that all of his predecessors in that post had college degrees, which he did not. His tenure at Deerfield was brief, only 2 years, but they were 2 pivotal years in his life. And there's 2 reasons I want to point out. One is this pretty young lady, Ora White. She was the preceptress at Deerfield Academy, meaning the teacher of the female students. Edward was the teacher of the male students. Because Deerfield Academy was a very progressive educational institution for its day, it believed in the equal education of young men and young women, but not in the same room at the same time. Heaven forbid. So Edward and Ora worked closely together and became good friends. Now, Ora was very well educated and had skills in math and science and in the decorative arts. She was also a Calvinist of the most orthodox stripe. That is, one who believed in the personal relationship between a believer and the Creator, in the necessity of repentance and rebirth in Jesus Christ, roughly the equivalent of a Christian fundamentalist today. Edward, on the other hand, was a Unitarian. And if you know anything about Protestant theology, you see a problem here. Those are polar opposites in the continuum of Protestant theology, at least in those times. And so you might have thought that would have created an obstacle to their relationship, and it might have, except that Ora managed to convince Edward of the errors of his ways, and Edward Hitchcock converted to Calvinism. And that shared faith became critical to their relationship for the rest of their lives, hint, hint, and also, interestingly, to Edward's scientific career. The other big event during his 2 years as headmaster at Deerfield was the publication of his first major scientific paper. It was about the geology of the Connecticut River Valley. It appeared in the first volume of the American Journal of Science, published at Yale. And by the way, that journal is still published to this day. It included a map drawn by Ora that you can see on the right there. She, by the way, would draw I'm not exaggerating when I say over 2,000 drawings, paintings, illustrations for his articles, for his books, and even for his teaching. She made murals for his teaching. The biggest one was 16 feet long, if you can imagine that. Well, in that article, I'll spare you the rest of the article, but I do want to read you one paragraph which has great significance. I'm not sure it received much attention at the time, but I think when I read it to you, you'll see why we see it as being so important today. In the town of Gill, he wrote, there is a cataract in Connecticut River from 30 to 40 feet in height, and it is believed that the alluvial region and part of the secondary shown on the map from this fall to the place where the river passes between Mount Holyoke and Tom was formerly the bed of a lake. South of these hills commences another alluvial and secondary tract. Perhaps this region also was the bed of a lake. Well, today we know those lakes to be, if you can see that on your computer, to be Glacial Lake Hitchcock. But the idea that glaciers had anything to do with New England or anywhere in the northeastern North America, that idea had never occurred to Edward Hitchcock, nor to any, so far as I know, geologist in his day. That was subject for the future. Well, in 1821, the couple were married in Amherst. There's the newspaper notice of it, June 6th of 1821. And a few days later, they put all their goods and chattels into a wagon, and I can assure you they didn't have many goods and very few chattels, and drove that wagon the 15 miles or so up a very rough road to the town of Conway, Massachusetts, where Edward had been appointed junior pastor of the Congregational Church. And they took up residence in a house that still stands there. One of the conditions of Edward's appointment was that he be allowed up to 5 weeks a year to pursue his scientific interests. And that's where we find him 2 years later, perhaps his first such expedition, on the wharf there in Holmes Hole. He rented a chaise, that is a one-horse, one-seater carriage, and headed off down the rutted and sandy roads of Martha's Vineyard, first to Edgartown, and then to West Tisbury, then to Chilmark, and finally back to West Tisbury. Along the way, and it must have been it must have turned more than a few eyes, the sight of that austere figure trundling along the island's rough and rutted roads, stopping frequently to survey the landscape, make sketches and notes, and collect samples. Well, as he traveled around the vineyard, Edward observed 3 distinct geological zones that are shown on this map, again drawn by Ora Hitchcock now. To the south, he found what he described as the alluvial zone, a perfectly level, sandy tract, uninhabited and uninhabitable. He named it the alluvial formation. On the western side of the island, shown in red, He noted a second zone consisting of alternating beds of various colored clays, sand, and pebbles that he termed the plastic clay formation, borrowing a term from British geology of his day. But the feature that most attracted Hitchcock's attention on this first visit to the vineyard lay atop the clay from Chilmark to Holmes Hole, and it's shown in green on that map. He said of this formation, he called this the diluvial formation, and he said of it, all the northwestern extent of the island is hilly and uneven, with no abrupt precipices, but rising into rounded eminences consisting of loose stones varying in size from that of the smallest pebbles to that of masses 10 or even 15 feet in diameter, as well as huge boulders, some over 50 feet in diameter. Most striking of all to Hitchcock on that first trip was the quantity of those huge boulders, scattered, he said, over these hills on every side. At first, he assumed these to be outcrops of the, and by the way, this is an image from the Martha's Vineyard Museum from Chilmark. Some years later, obviously, photography didn't exist at Hitchcock's time. But he at first he assumed that these were outcrops of the underlying bedrock, but the local residents soon set him straight on that notion. There was, they assured him, no bedrock to be found anywhere beneath the sands of Martha's Vineyard. Well, about 7 months later, and there's some picture of some of those boulders along the beach on the western side of the island, and some of the boulders formed into stone walls in the interior. 7 months later, his article appeared again in the Journal of Science, the American Journal of Science. It was the first detail, this was January of 1824, so it's exactly 200 years ago this year. And it was the first detailed geological study of the vineyard, or for that matter, so far as I know, anywhere in the Cape region, to appear in print. And he would publish over 60 articles in the American Journal of Science in his lifetime. This was the second or the third. In that article, Hitchcock addressed the matter of those huge boulders. If they were not derived from the underlying bedrock, where had they come from, he asked. Here he made a telling observation, one that would resonate among geologists worldwide over the coming decades. Those boulders, that diluvium, as he called it, must have been derived from the rocks that occur in place along the coast on the mainland. There it was, a hint of what was to come, a revelation in stone. Well, near the end of the same article, Hitchcock made yet another point with profound implications. Those three formations that he observed on Martha's Vineyard were not limited to the vineyard. He wrote, "The vineyard and Nantucket are a continuation of the extensive formation hitherto called alluvial, of which Long Island has been regarded as the northeastern limit." He had visited Long Island a few years earlier. "If we prolong this curve still further, it will include Nova Scotia and at least part of Newfoundland." That was a pretty profound statement. We can see that Hitchcock was taking his observations from that brief trip to the vineyard and drawing a larger inference about all of the North Atlantic coast of North America. And of course, that observation raised the question, what force was responsible for this 1,000-mile-long accumulation of sand, silt, gravel, and boulders? And for that, he referred to the diluvium. Now, a word about the diluvium. Edward Hitchcock, like most scientists of his time, regarded much of the surface geology of the Earth as the result of a flood, the great flood of Genesis, the flood of Noah and his ark. So when he assigned the label diluvium to the detritus covering the northwestern portion of Martha's Vineyard, he was ascribing its deposition to that great biblical cataclysm, a conclusion with which most geologists of his day concurred. Now, as I've said, Edward Hitchcock was a man of strict Orthodox Christian faith and was ill-inclined to trifle with God's word. but he was also an astute observer and thinker, particularly on matters geological. And that mixture of pebbles and stones, all apparently transported from the north and west, it clearly troubled him. And those huge boulders, some weighing 100 tons or more, what flood, he asked, however powerful, could move one of those? And why would a flood carry all that material in one direction rather than dispersing it randomly over the sea bottom? In time, those questions would lead him to a stunning conclusion, one that would overturn many long held beliefs, both scientific and religious. Well, 7 years later, Edward Hitchcock returned to southeastern Massachusetts, no longer as a church pastor, but now as professor of chemistry and natural history at Amherst College, a position to which he had been named in 1825. Amherst College had been founded only a few years earlier with the primary mission of training young men for the Christian ministry. It's clear that he saw that post as an opportunity to carry on both his preaching and his scientific interests. He was at Amherst for 38 years, 37 years, and he served as a third president for 9 years. Well, in 1830, Hitchcock received an appointment from Governor Levi Lincoln, shown in the bottom left there with that interesting hairdo for a man of his time. Um, his assignment was to carry out a detailed geological survey of the Commonwealth, the main purpose of which would be to identify some of the state's untapped mineral resources. Now, this was a massive undertaking. It took him over 4 field seasons. He traveled 135 days in that horse-drawn wagon, covered more than 3,000 miles, visited 266 cities and towns across the Commonwealth, collected more than 5,000 specimens. He also kept voluminous notes and made sketches of the rocks and rock formations he observed. This map shows his second excursion of 1830 and his first to southeastern Massachusetts for the survey. And you can see he went all the way out to the tip of the Cape, went back down to the Vineyard, and then returned to the Boston area, and finally out west to back to Amherst. What you see here is a page from Hitchcock's field notes. And of the day he and his assistant first arrived on Cape Cod. There it is, from Sandwich to Barnstable. I should mention here that my Hitchcock research would never have been possible had it not been for the enormous collection of Hitchcock's unpublished handwritten field notes, letters, and sermons preserved in the archives and special collections of Amherst College. And I'm indebted to the college for preserving those materials, making them accessible, and to the staff of the archives for helping me out so many ways along the 7 years that I've been involved in this project. Not surprisingly, Hitchcock's first observation of the Cape in his notes harked back to his visit to the Vineyard 7 years ago. He wrote, "From Sandwich to Barnstable, 12 miles, diluvium all the way. In many places, the boulders are enormously large, weighing 100 to 200 tons, and very thick. In short, the place of the country and the geological character appear to be precisely like those of Martha's Vineyard and the Elizabeth Islands. I doubt not, but the same remark will apply to the whole of Cape Cod." He wrote that on September 4th, 1830, his first day on Cape Cod. Now, some of Hitchcock's notes from that first foray to the Cape read more like random musings of tourists than the methodical observations of a scientist. He wrote, "The roads are not as bad as we expected to find them." I don't know what they were expecting. "The scenery, made up of sand hills, marshes, salt works, and here and there a copse of low trees, is picturesque, though generally dreary. The houses appear better than we had anticipated, and there is an appearance of comfort and even thrift which we had not expected. The inhabitants also appear obliging and civil everywhere." It sounds like he was surprised. Professor Hitchcock had just a single complaint along the way, one that you might even hear to this day from tourists visiting the region for the first time. His complaint was, "There is a great deficiency of guide boards, and we are apt to get out of the way." Well, uh, he frequently made notes of as he traveled through Barnstable, Yarmouth, Dennis, and Brewster, he observed salt works, salt marshes, and peatlands or bogs. Now, cranberry cultivation on man-made bogs had barely begun at that time. So here he was looking at naturally occurring peatlands, such as are still found in some places on the Lower Cape, Nantucket, the Vineyard, the coast of Maine, and maritime Canada. He was particularly interested in peat, and remember, his was an economic focus, and peat would be considered a mineral resource. Peat, he wrote, is very abundant in almost every town on the Cape and the white cedar swamps. Hitherto it has not been much dug, but we perceive the inhabitants frequently getting it out. It must prove an invaluable treasure. And in his final report, he wrote, I cannot but regard the existence of so large quantities of peat on Cape Cod and Nantucket as a great blessing to the inhabitants. Hitchcock reserved his most effusive descriptions for the Cape scenery for its outermost extremity. Of Truro, he wrote, Truro exhibits the most remarkable example of diluvial action that I ever saw. The whole town is scooped out and piled up in that peculiar manner which characterizes diluvium, the hills being from 1 to 200 feet high and often very steep. Still farther up the arm of the Cape, he made this observation. The appearance of Provincetown is exceedingly picturesque. As we ride along the beach below the houses, first stand the windmills, then the houses in irregular order, generally 2 or 3 rows, and mixed with yards for drying fish and salt works. A semicircular bay is enclosed on the north and east by a sandy beach and low sand hills almost destitute of vegetation, which seem to threaten to bury the village and to fill the harbor. And then he wrote, a visit to Provincetown by land would probably, in most cases, be quite as effectual a remedy for ennui and other fashionable complaints as a resort to Ballston and Saratoga. But wouldn't the Reverend Hitchcock be pleased to know that today, 2 centuries later, Provincetown continues to be an effectual remedy for ennui and other fashionable complaints. Traveling south once again, Hitchcock described an odd sensation that he termed a mirage, an experience that I can recall from my boyhood vacations on Cape Cod long ago. My father pointed this out to me as we were on the beach, I think on Nauset Beach one day. Hitchcock writes, a curious deception was noticed by myself and 2 companions in the sandy regions of the Cape, particularly in Orleans, exactly where I saw it. We seem, even on level ground, to be ascending, in other words, to be placed in a basin. We observed this mirage so frequently, and it was so striking, that it could not have been a mistake. Frequently, the road seemed to have an ascent of 2 or 3 degrees before us, and on passing forward and looking back, an elevation equally great appeared in that direction. This phenomenon seems to be of the nature of what the sailors call looming, but I cannot explain it, and especially why it should appear in a sandy rather than any other region. Well, there you see an illustration for looming. It's not from Cape Cod, it's not with palm trees. I never saw a ship hovering across the horizon, but I understand that that's been known to be observed. But I certainly did observe that sort of bowl-shaped feeling, not only looking out at the sea, but even on dry land, as he mentions, and is believed to be part of refraction of the Earth's atmosphere when you can see a long distance with no obstacles in the way. Well, Hitchcock's description of that mirage may have been the first ever to appear in print, but it would not be the last. Some 30 years later, another astute observer of the natural world, Henry David Thoreau, wrote of a similar experience in his famous essay, Cape Cod, even mentioning Hitchcock's earlier observations. He wrote, on our way thither, that was to Provincetown, we had occasion to admire various beautiful forms and colors of the sand, and we noticed an interesting mirage, which I have since found that Hitchcock also observed on the sands of the Cape. Hitchcock's description, Hitchcock was not surprised to find many huge boulders on the Cape, not unlike those he had seen on the Vineyard. Boulders such as this one at Tonset in Orleans, Doan's Rock, which is probably the most famous glacial erratic on Cape Cod and the biggest, I believe. And a boulder, I remember climbing on that boulder as a boy because it sits on the shores of Cliff Pond at Nickerson State Park in Brewster. Well, at Falmouth, Hitchcock boarded a steamer intent on studying the Gay Head Cliffs in the town we know today as Aquina. He had not visited Gay Head on his first trip. For what he witnessed on that excursion, he spared no superlatives. He wrote, "The most interesting spot on Martha's Vineyard is Gay Head, which constitutes the western extremity of this island and consists of clays and sands of various colors. Its height cannot be more than 150 feet, yet its variegated aspect and the richness of its colors render it a striking and even splendid object when seen from the ocean. Every lover of natural scenery would be delighted to visit this spot. There is nothing to compare with it in New England." And that's an illustration from his final report done by Aura, but rather poorly colored by probably somebody that the printer hired to color it. Here's a photograph, a more recent photograph, which does that landmark a great deal more justice. He was also very interested in the clay formation there and collected close to 100 specimens on that one visit. This is a catalog, just 2 pages of a long catalog of his collections that were presented to the state some years later, and it includes sand, clay, remains of plants, mollusks, crustaceans, and even shark's teeth, all from Gay Head. Back on the mainland, Hitchcock traveled north on the Cape. Once again, he was perplexed by the many huge boulders scattered over that sandy peninsula. He wrote, "From Falmouth to Plymouth, 36 miles, diluvium all the way. But in the west part of Falmouth and Sandwich, the boulders are so large and thick and so numerous and the hills so high that there can be no doubt that granite and gneiss are in place a little below the surface." And when he says in place, he means the bedrock. Well, in his 1833 report, Hitchcock reiterated his belief that the boulders of Cape Cod were derived from the bedrock not far from the surface, and his geological map for that report indicated as such. And I've colored in the part of his map that showed granite bedrock in that 1833 report. Nevertheless, he seemed to leave the subject open to further discussion when he wrote, "The map will show that I have extended a strip of granite from Plymouth into Barnstable County as far east as Brewster and another branch into Falmouth. Others must judge." Here he's always the cautious scientist. "Others must judge whether the evidence of the existence of granite in place in the region under consideration is probable enough to justify me in the course I have taken." Well, in his 1841 revision of that map, the granite bedrock, as you can see, is gone. In his explanation, he hedged a bit on the question. He said, "As the entire surface is diluvium, no bedrock to be seen, I thought it better to color it as such, thus representing what I know exists there, instead of something about which I am not certain." Always Edward Hitchcock, the man of facts. One other interesting phenomenon that Hitchcock received reports about was the submarine, what he called submarine forests. He wrote, "A pilot told me that on the west side of the harbor, that's Holmes Hole, he had seen what looked like a swamp or marsh, and another man said he believed some cedar stumps had been found formerly toward the lighthouse in shallow water. Mr. Allen of Chilmark tells me that cedar stumps have been found on the northwest shore of the Vineyard near Gay Head." Hitchcock also heard similar reports from Nantucket, Yarmouth, and elsewhere along the Atlantic coastline. Well, those submarine forests are still to be found and have attracted scientists right up to the present. What you see here are images from a 2014 study. There's the citation down there, by Christopher Mayo and others, done on 100, what they call a paleo forest of 111 cedar tree stumps that can be seen at South Cape Beach in Mashpee at very low tides. They are regarded today, of course, as evidence of sea level rise in the last 10,000 years, due at least in part to the melting of the polar ice. And those oldest stumps, they radiocarbon dated to over 1,000 years. Well, in his 1833 report, Hitchcock wrote, geologists are not a little perplexed satisfactorily to account for submarine forests. In general, it has been supposed that these forests have subsided in consequence of earthquakes or other internal movements of the earth. Hitchcock seems to have accepted the idea that those forests had once stood on higher ground, well above sea level, before the land subsided. It is doubtful that he ever contemplated another explanation for that phenomenon, rising sea level from glacial meltwater. But even in 1833, the idea that a vast glacier once covered most of New England was the stuff of science fiction, even to Professor Edward Hitchcock, but not for long. Also on the mainland, Hitchcock observed two other important features that further reinforced his doubts about the origin of that so-called diluvium. Gouged in bedrock across New England, he noted deep furrows, nearly all with the same orientation, from northwest to southeast. In addition, he observed sinuous trains of large boulders, many extending tens of miles from their origins, all with similar orientations. On this map, we can see the probable path of three such boulders. There are many more to list. Doan's Rock is believed to have originated by similar rock material somewhere north of Boston. Is a boulder on at Day Head that's believed to have originated south of Boston. And those were both found in the late 19th and early 20th century. But that third one there, boulder train of magnetic iron ore, was, so far as I can tell, first discovered and described in print by Edward Hitchcock in his 1833 report. It's a 30 or 35 mile long train of magnetic iron ore that originated in Cumberland, Rhode Island, right near the Mass border, and terminated in Newport. So it can be found the full length, or almost the full length, of Rhode Island, all of a rock type that could only have originated in Cumberland, Rhode Island. Well, Hitchcock's report was published in 1833, and it was a landmark in American geology, the first comprehensive geological survey of any state. It was surprisingly popular, considering its length, over 700 pages and 250,000, a quarter of a million words. His report and his survey became models that nearly 24 other states replicated over the next 20 years or so. In the early 20th century, George Perkins Merrill, curator of geology at the Smithsonian, wrote that Hitchcock's report marked an epoch in American geological work. Well, by now, Edward Hitchcock had seen more than enough evidence to make him skeptical of the diluvial hypothesis, that notion that the great flood of Genesis was the force responsible for most of the sculpting of the Earth's surface. And in his report, he had these words: making every allowance for the reduction of gravity of those boulders when in water, I confess I cannot conceive how such a work could have been effected by this agency, and that means by water. But then, if not by water, then by what agency? Well, that question continued to bedevil Edward Hitchcock. Then in 1841, he received a copy of a geological treatise entitled Études sur les glaciers. The author was a Swiss scientist named Louis Agassiz, shown here. Agassiz put forth the radical notion that ice, not water, was the primary agent responsible for sculpting much of the surface of the northern hemisphere, that a huge ice cap had accumulated in the northern polar regions, gradually expanding southward over hundreds of thousands of years. It was a glacier or series of glaciers of massive extent, and it gouged, scraped, and bulldozed the Earth's surface as it advanced. Now, one side note here, some research suggests that much of Agassiz's work on glaciers had been adapted. You notice that expression? We could put it in air quotes, adapted without credit from the writings of several other scientists, most notably Jean de Charpentier, a German-Swiss geologist. When Hitchcock read Agassiz's treatise, he was an immediate convert. Oh, and there's an outline of that ice sheet showing the maximum extent right over Cape Cod and the islands. Well, when Edward Hitchcock read Agassiz's treatise, he was an immediate convert. Just a few months later, he attended and gave the keynote address at the Academy of the Association of American Geologists at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. This was April of 1841, and he described the theory of the glacial origin of those effects with evangelical fervor. He said, while reading this work, I seemed to be acquiring a new geological sense, and I looked upon our smooth and striated rocks, our accumulated gravel, and the tout ensemble of diluvial phenomena with new eyes. Hitchcock's ringing endorsement gave the theory of continental glaciation wide exposure and credibility among American scientists, although there remained a good deal of resistance in some quarters. Hitchcock himself backpedaled and equivocated on the idea repeatedly over the next 20 years, but the evidence was strong and compelling, and by the 1860s, that theory had been accepted and embraced by most scientists in America and worldwide. Edward Hitchcock's younger son, Charles Henry Hitchcock, went on to teach geology at Dartmouth College for 40 years, and his main area of interest was glacial geology. But as to non-scientists, particularly theologians, members of the clergy, and other people of faith who were suspicious of new ideas in science, the fact that the Reverend Edward Hitchcock, well known as a devout man of strict Orthodox Christian views, was comfortable with such a notion may well have given them license to accept the theory. So Edward Hitchcock didn't originate the theory of continental glaciation, but he embraced it, so far as I can tell, the first American geologist to do so. And his acceptance of that theory went a long way to gaining acceptance elsewhere in North American geology. In his revised report in 1841, later the same year, he brought these new revelations back to those visits to Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard when he wrote these words: "Is it possible that the whole of Cape Cod is nothing but a vast terminal moraine produced by a glacier advancing through Massachusetts Bay and scooping out the materials that now form the Cape?" While it was still an idea that was struggling to gain converts, it is clear that Edward Hitchcock was the first scientist to place Cape Cod in the context of continental glaciation. Now, you may well associate Edward Hitchcock's name with yet another important revolution in American geology. He was the first scientist to study the fossilized tracks of what we know today were dinosaurs. He didn't call the makers of those tracks dinosaurs. The term hadn't even been coined when he began his research in 1835. He regarded them as tracks of ancient birds or bird-like creatures. But of course, we know today that many dinosaurs, particularly those called theropods, were in fact the ancestors of modern-day birds. Once again, Edward Hitchcock was ahead of his time, in the forefront of American science. I don't know how well you can see those images. They're partly blocked on my screen, but those are scenes from the Bonesky Museum of Natural History at Amherst College, where Edward Hitchcock's collections are on spectacular display. Robert Baker, one of America's foremost dinosaur authorities, wrote that Hitchcock was, quote, the earliest and in many ways the best mind in dinosaur science. All of us 21st century students of the dinosaur-bird relations owe a tip of the hat to the Reverend Edward Hitchcock. One other side note, Edward Hitchcock, as I mentioned, was a very important figure at Amherst College. During his presidency, he saved Amherst College from bankruptcy. He was also a founding trustee of Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, which became Mount Holyoke College. All four of his daughters attended there. He was a trustee for the rest of his life and a good friend of Mary Lyons. He was also one of the prime movers and shakers for the movement to establish a Massachusetts Agricultural College. It didn't happen until after his death, but it happened in Amherst. And of course, that's the what we know today as the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So in his lifetime, Edward Hitchcock published nearly 150 articles in scholarly journals in science and religion. Remember, all he had was a high school education. He also published 50 books. But if you asked him which book he believed was his most important, he would probably say this book. I know he would because he said as much in his memoir. It's called The Religion of Geology, and it was published first in 1851. All of his adult life, he'd been worried that advances in science would undermine people's faith. And he made sure that late in his life, he addressed that question. He wrote in The Religion of Geology, the hostility between science and revelation, we believe, is only apparent, not real. When rightly interpreted and understood, they will appear in perfect unison. Edward Hitchcock believed to the depth of his soul that God guided the search for scientific truth just as surely as he guided the search for moral and spiritual truth. Interesting that even now, 200 years later, that's a good thing to hear about, isn't it? Just 8 years later, in 1857, I guess that would be 6 years later. No, 1859 is the correct year. A book was published in England that is unquestionably the most important work in the field of biology of the 19th century. It was, of course, On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, in which he argued that life was not created in an instant by a deity, but had developed, evolved gradually over the millennia, one species giving rise to another, process called transmutation, and he asserted that the driving force was natural selection. Darwin's theory was assailed by scientists and theologians alike. Even Louis Agassiz, who was probably the most eminent scientist in America at his time, in that time, refused to his dying day to accept Darwinism. Agassiz wrote that it took away from the creator the act of creation. Well, Edward Hitchcock, too, at first criticized Darwin's theories on both scientific and religious grounds. But then, in the last year of his life, he published an article in the journal Bibliotheca Sacra that showed his thinking beginning to pivot. He wrote, "But after all, the real question is not whether these hypotheses accord with our religious views, but whether they are true." He went on to say, "The fact that these new creations are repeated at intervals and seem to form a part of a series of operations which we know to be natural makes it quite probable that they also are natural. Perhaps this unknown law, the laws of Darwinism, will by and by be discovered, as many new laws have been, to explain phenomena once supposed to be miraculous because anomalous and inexplicable." In other words, Hitchcock suggested these processes that Darwin asserted, transmutation of species, natural selection, even human evolution, might all be parts of God's creation, just as surely as are the laws of motion, of thermodynamics, of gravity. He kept the door open. He kept his mind open to the possibility that these were all part of God's plan for the universe. So Edward Hitchcock's life was a dual journey of faith in God, a dual journey of faith, faith in God and faith in science. It led him to question some of the basic tenets of his religion, as well as some of the fundamental scientific ideas of his day. And that journey began with a visit to Martha's Vineyard in 1823 in the sight of those huge boulders scattered over a sandy Chilmark plain. It was reinforced by subsequent visits to Cape Cod and the islands in 1830 and 1832. In a sermon he delivered to his congregation in January 1823, that's just a few months before that first trip to Martha's Vineyard, Reverend Hitchcock warned his parishioners to pay heed to the world around them. Let the unbeliever then remember, he said, that as he passes over our hills, the very stones cry out against him. Well, the boulders did cry out to Edward Hitchcock that day on Martha's Vineyard, and the message they bore was truly a revelation in stone. Okay, well, I will leave it there, except to show you a few acknowledgments. Again, particularly important was Amherst College Archives and Special Collections that have been so generous to me. But there are many other historic organizations and libraries that were equally cooperative. I hope if you're interested, you'll read my book. It's available in print and in numerous ebook formats. And there's many library copies around the state of Massachusetts and even in other states as well. I'd also invite you to visit my webpage, www.edwardhitchcock.com, where you'll find much more about the man and the book. I particularly draw your attention to Hitchcockiana, which is my blog, which I periodically add new articles to as I learn more about Edward Hitchcock. For instance, the most recent one is about the subject of tonight's talk there, the Edward Hitchcock and the geology of Cape Cod and the islands. There's another one about his giant boulders, and it talks about several of the boulders that I myself visited, including that picture on the bottom is of me standing in front of the boulder he called the Green Mountain Giant. It's in the southern Vermont, and it is a giant, I can attest. You might be particularly enjoy reading about my meeting with these two bright-eyed young people. That's Emily Hitchcock, a recent graduate of Smith College, and Sawyer Hitchcock, a recent graduate of Ithaca College. Well, as you might guess, Emily and Sawyer are the great, 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 great grandchildren of Edward and Aura. And I had such a great time that day talking to them about their lives and their thoughts on their famous forebears. I also have a YouTube channel, who doesn't, right? And there's right now 7 short videos, all in the 12 to 15, 12 to 20 minute range on various subjects related to Edward Hitchcock. So I will leave it there and stop sharing and entertain your questions with Rob's help.
Okay, well, Mark Petruzzi makes a notes that he says seen dinosaur footprints in Rocky Hill, Connecticut, and he's of the opinion that that's the southern shore of Lake Hitchcock.
I think that's correct. There was another lake south of there, down to Haddam, which also existed at that time. But I think he's right in thinking that Rocky Hill is the southernmost extent of the main lake. Yes.
Mhm. Any other questions for Robert?
I have one written, Bob.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Frank. I think he can hear you.
Hi, I just want a quick anecdote. I was an electrical engineering student at City University in New York and was forced to take another science elective, and geology popped up. And the teacher was with the Lamont from Columbia University, the Lamont Geological Observatory on the Palisades. And I quickly learned that the New York area had actually, probably in his opinion, the most fascinating geological history and availability of fossils and glacial moraine and everything. And I always remember one of the jokes he said. He said, "Just remember, Manhattan is built on a pile of schist."
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a geology.
And it's not nice.
yeah,
Um,
little
yeah.
My
geology
grandson
joke.
is my grandson is just graduated environmental science from Middlebury, and geology is one of his majors. But anyhow, but my question was very simply, I grew up on Long Island, okay, and of course, my thinking, or at least if I remember from high school, before I move up to Cape Cod, and how love people in Cape Cod love Cape Cod and think it's the only place in the world that is Cape Cod. And I often like to point out to them that it's a terminal moraine. And guess what? Long Island is also a terminal moraine. And the
Yeah.
same flora and fauna that exist on Cape Cod exist on Long Island.
Yeah,
So,
Mhm.
yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
is
what's
that
also interesting
correct that it is one of the limit of the
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yep.
is, well, it's also interesting, Frank, is having also grown up on Long Island, that the South Shore and the North Shore of Long Island look suspiciously like the South Shore and the North Shore of Cape Cod.
Oh, absolutely. When my cousins from Long Island came to visit me in Chatham, they said, "You didn't go very far."
Mm,
When I moved to Cape Cod,
that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
except it's you don't put your boat in the water in April on Cape Cod.
Yeah, right.
Well, anyway, thank you very much. This was fascinating, and
Sure.
I know I plan on sending this. Hey, Bob, is this available online? This
It's going to be on YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yep, yep.
okay.
Well, if you mean the book, yes,
Oh,
absolutely. I always urge my readers to go to your local independent bookstore first and give them a chance to get the book, and they can get it. But yes, it is available from the usual suspects online. Yep.
My grandson is teaching at Belmont Hill Academy,
Yeah,
college, excuse me, high school, middle school
yeah.
students in geology. So I think
Uh-huh.
he might
Yep,
enjoy it.
yep, yep, absolutely. Yep.
terrific.
And about New York, two of the first dinosaur skeleton. Hitchcock didn't find any skeletal material up and down the Connecticut River, only tracks. And that was a bit of a problem. But the first real dinosaur skeletons to be found in North America were found in New Jersey. I don't know, only 30 or 40 miles from New York City.
Oh, absolutely. The other side of the Palisades is filled with fossils and
Uh-huh.
Secaucus and that area. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
you can
yeah,
find some really old stuff there.
Yeah,
yeah.
Frank, right next to Jimmy Hoffa.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
yeah, you're welcome.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank you very much, Robert. We're going to send you one of our very rare Chatham Marconi logo ball caps as a token of our thanks, and also, of course, a year's membership in Chatham Marconi Maritime Center. So we
Great.
thank you very much once again.
Okay.